定刻になりましたので、ただいまから女性と経済に関する勉強会との共催で、ハーバード大学のブリントン教授をお招きし、Esri-政策フォーラムを開催をいたします。本日の進行を務める内閣府経済社会総合研究所次長の林智子と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。本日は森まさこ内閣総理大臣補佐官にご参加をいただく予定でしたが、森補佐官は参議院法務委員会の審議に出席しなければならなくなったため、ビデオメッセージをいただいております。それでは開会にあたりまして、森まさこ補佐官のメッセージをお届けいたします。
こんにちは。内閣総理大臣補佐官女性活躍担当の森まさこと申します。本日は私が総理補佐官として主催をしております女性と経済勉強会にハーバード大学のメアリー・ブリントン教授をお迎えいたしまして、内閣府のEsri政策フォーラムと共催をして、パネルディスカッションができることを大変嬉しく思います。私、国会審議の関係上、冒頭お話をさせていただきますことをお許しください。ハーバードのライシャワー研究所所長のブリントン先生が、縛られる日本人、人口減少をもたらす規範を打ち破れるかという本をお書きになって、日本のですね、男性社長の皆様方に大変評判であり、ありがたく思っております。この我が国においては、なかなかこの少子化が解消されない、状態が続いて、おりますけれども、私12年前に、安倍総理の下で、男女共同参画女性活躍大臣と少子化大臣を兼任させていただきました。女性活躍と少子化対策はイコールである、両輪である、車の両輪であると考えております。しかし、女性活躍大臣と少子化大臣は、その後、ずっと10年間、別々の人間によってなされてきました。このことが、また少子化対策の遅れに少なからず影響があったのではないかと考えております。と申しますのも、日本においては、少子化対策は女性活躍を語らずには進まないと考えているからです。現金の、給付も同じでして、現金給付で、少子化対策成功した国はございません。その後、その失敗に気がついて、現物給付、これは政策用語でございますので、もっと、別の言葉に置き換えれば、子育て無料化とでもいう、政策によってですね、その制度を利用するときに無料であるという、そういう制度によってのみ、少子化対策というものは成功をしている諸外国の例があります。そしてその各国の政策を真似していく、取り入れていくということは大変重要なんですが、まずスタートラインを一緒にしないと、闇雲に取り入れても効果が出ないと思っております。と申しますのも、全く違う点、それは女性活躍でございます。ジェンダーギャップ指数で116位、G7 で最下位の日本が、女性活躍の部分を底上げせずに、少子化対策で、また現金を配布しても、これは長期的な人口減少の増加、その回復には至らないと考えております。この全く違う点、劣っている点、女性活躍というのをまずしっかり整えていく。忘れてはならないのが少子化と女性活躍は車の両輪であるということです。仕事と家庭の両立という分野で少し、その女性活躍のエッセンスは入っておりますけれども、例えば家庭内の育児、家事のケアの女性の負担、これは欧米が3対1で、まだ欧米でも負担ありますけれども、日本は7対1か8対1、8倍もですね、家事、育児を負担をしていて、仕事と両立できるわけもございません。このようなことに抜本的に、切り込んでいかなくてはならない。間違ってはならないのは、 女性活躍というのは、キラキラしている女性をさらにキラキラさせるというふうに、誤解をしている人が多いんですけれども、そうではなくて、悩み、苦しんでいる女性にですね、寄り添っていく、ということが大事です。ここで悩み、苦しんでいる女性というのは、決して低所得の女性だけではなく、低所得の女性もしっかりと、カバーしながら、高所得でも、中間所得でも、頑張っている女性たちも応援していかないと、最近ですね、高所得の女性たちのところで少子化が回復したんです。ですからそこをやめようという動きがあります。これは全く愚かなことでですね、なぜこの少子化対策が我が国で進まないか、それは予算の点も政策の点も国の政策の中で優先順位が後回しだから、優先順位が下なんです。この優先順位を上げる人は誰ですか？それは意思決定層です。意思決定層に女性が入っていかなくてはなりません。今、出生率をちょっと回復している30代から40代の、高所得または活躍している女性たちをもっと応援して、もっと仕事と両立できる、そしてもっと子供を産むようにしていかなければ、そういう方たちが女性の国会議員、そして女性の総理も、そして女性社長も、会社の取締役も、そういう方々に日本社会の中の意思決定層に入ってこなければ、女性のですね、働く女性たちの悩み、苦しみは解決できません。この点で、少子化の対策を考える会議を見渡してください。すべて男性ではないですか？もしかしたら各省庁のトップがすべて男性ではないですか？そこのところをですね、少子化政策をするところだけでもいいです。3割女性をしていただいて、先ほどのように8倍多く子育ての家事育児をしている。もしかしたら官僚の皆様は8倍どころか10対1かも10対0かもしれませんよ。そういう方々の首を揃えて少子化対策をしたって何もいいアイデアが浮かんでこない。これを同質性のリスクと言います。同質の同じ人間が一生懸命考えた。どんなに優秀な人たちでもそこにはイノベーションが起きないんです。何のために女性活躍をやるのか、何のために少子化対策をやるのか、根本の趣旨を考えてほしいんです。それは、この国にイノベーションを起こして30年間賃金が上がっていない若い人たちが子供を産む家庭を作るということに夢を持てない。そういったことにイノベーションを起こして、改革をして、国を前に進めていく、この国に未来を見せてあげる。そのためにするんです。そのイノベーションを起こすためには多様性が必要です。男性だけではなく、女性が入って半分の人口がいる女性がですね、意思決定層に入っていくということが、これはもう間違いなく、絶対的に必要な条件なんです。ぜひですね、同質性の皆様方がやっていると何を間違っているかも気づかない。その間違いによって何を失っているかも気がつかない。その失っているのは子供の数だけではなく、女性の幸せだけではなく、この国の未来そのものを失っているということに気がついていただきたいと思います。もっと政策的なこともたくさんお話をしたいんですけれども、私の時間が足りませんで、またですね、これは英国大使館の、企画するですね、BCJ の方でも、私が過去の政策からずっと振り返った問題点の指摘をですね、してまいりたいと思います。最後に一つ、私からもともと提案をずっとしてきていることはですね、各国がやっています。ジェンダーカウンシルです。フィリピン。アジアでジェンダーギャップ指数が高いフィリピンでもやっています。台湾でもやっています。インドでもやっています。OECD が提言したジェンダーカウンシルは最近バイデン大統領もホワイトハウスの中に作りました。これはすべての政策が、意思決定層に女性がいるかどうかをチェックします。つまりですね、政策の中身は見ないんですよ。ただ、その政策、その補助金、その予算、それを作った人たちの中に、意思決定層に女性が何割いましたかというところをチェックするんです。 このチェックが我が国ではまだなされる機関がございません。私のところでですね、ぜひですね、それを作っていただきたいというような提案をしているところです。例えばこういうことが最近ありました。国交省がですね、チラシを作って、まちづくり、過疎の村のまちづくりを応援します。36人のエキスパートを国交省からどれでも選び放題。チラシに載った36人の顔写真は全員男性だったんです。このことがマスコミに批判されて、後からちょっとだけ女性が入りましたが、問題は意思決定層がこのアイデアを決定したとき、そしてチラシを印刷したとき、そのチラシを配るためにチェックしたときに、誰一人女性がいないという問題点に気がつかなかったということです。これが同質性のリスクです。意思決定層に女性を入れていく、そのことをチェックする機関、ジェンダーカウンシルを作っていくためにですね、今頑張っているところです。そんなお話をして、私の冒頭の挨拶に変えさせていただきます。今日の議論が実りあるものになることをお祈りをしております。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
それでは、ハーバード大学教授で、来社は日本研究所の所長も務めておられるメアリー・ブリントン教授から講演をいただきます。ブリントン先生は、長年にわたって日本のジェンダーの不平等、労働市場の問題、さらには、様々な日本の女性活躍や少子化の課題など、日本社会の課題について研究をされ、多数の著書、論文を執筆されておられます。昨年、縛られる日本人、人口減少をもたらす規範を打ち破れるか、という著作を、出版されたところでございます。また、日本の大学、東京大学、一橋大学、そして慶応大学の客員研究員をされていたこともあります。さらには、長年にわたり日米間の学術交流及び相互理解の促進に寄与されたことから、昨年秋には日本政府から叙勲を受け、旭日中綬章を受章されておられます。本日は様々なデータをご紹介いただきながら、日本が直面する課題と施策対応についてご講演をいただきます。それではブリントン先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
どうもありがとうございました。And I'm very thankful for this opportunity to speak today. And I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to speak in English rather than Japanese. I speak Japanese, but of course I'm living in the United States. So I'd like to get started. As everyone knows, Japan is facing two challenges, dilemmas in the 21st century. The demographic challenge, about which much has been written, and the economic challenge. Among major post-industrial countries, and in fact among all countries in the world, Japan is the most rapidly aging nation. Japan has the lowest ratio of working age adults, that is, adults aged 25 to 64, to adults over 65 years old. And in terms of the economic dilemmas or challenges that Japan is facing, slow economic growth, which has continued over many years, low productivity compared to other post-industrial nations, very large national debt, and of course, labor shortages. So what is the reason behind these issues? Obviously, the main reason is Japan's very low birth rate. This is not a new issue. It's actually an issue that has been continuing over several decades. So this graph is probably well known to the audience, but it shows Japan's total fertility rate, which is the most common way of measuring a birth rate for a country. It shows the rate from 1971 until 2021, so across about for exactly 50 years. So as you can see in this graph, Japan's total fertility rate actually dipped below what we call the population replacement rate by the mid-1970s. And since the mid-1970s, there has been a continued decline. And I think we can say that the birth rate has more or less stabilized at 1.3 children on average per woman. My comments today are based on the research I did for my recently published book. This book came out in September of last year. And in the book, I emphasize that it is crucial for Japan to break down social norms that support high gender inequality and the male breadwinner model of the family. And in its place, I emphasize in the book strengthening social norms that support gender equality and what we can call a dual earner, dual carer model of the family. This is tomobataraki type of family, and also type of family where both parents share in child rearing. In the book, I advocate strengthening social norms in Japan that support gender equality and a dual earner, dual carer model of the family. So this is a model of the family where both adults work in the labor market and both adults participate in kosodate. I'd ask is whether it was inevitable that the Japanese birth rate declined so much over these past several decades. To show you that no, this was not inevitable. And I think this is where the value in particular of comparative research with other countries becomes evident. Show a comparison of Japan, Sweden, and the United States. And the comparison is of what we call completed cohort fertility, which I will explain. So this way of measuring the birth rate is actually much more accurate than what we usually use, which is the total fertility rate. And the reason why is that the completed cohort fertility rate shows the average number of children that women had up until the end of their reproductive life cycle, 45歳か49歳まで. So I will now show you this graph. And what this shows is that women born in 1950 at the left-hand side of the graph in Japan and Sweden and the United States, women born in 1950 had around 2 children by the time they reached their late 40s. And this continued for several years. But as you can see in the graph, by the late 1950s, the birth rate began to fall in Japan. As in Sweden and the United States, the birth rate remained around 2 children or even a little more. So again, what this shows us is within the group of women born in a certain year, what was the average number of children they had? And Japan diverged very markedly from Sweden and the United States. Show this and other comparisons. Japanese government has passed policies in the last number of years that have tried to simultaneously address 2 goals. Was to raise the labor force participation rate of married women, especially mothers, in order to alleviate the labor shortages that the Japanese economy is already countering. Secondly, of course, there has been a goal of increasing the country's birth rate, which will help to alleviate future labor shortages that Japan will encounter. Now, in terms of the first goal, I think we can say it has been achieved. So, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had set this goal and worked towards it very strongly. And by 2018, you can see that the labor force participation rate of mothers rose slightly above the United States. And this indeed is a very important achievement. Show you a few graphs that indicate the relationship between women's labor force participation rate and the birth rate in OECD countries. Shows the relationship between the total fertility rate and female labor force participation in a number of countries in 1980. You can see there was a negative relationship. In other words, the countries that had higher labor force participation rates on the part of women had lower birth rates. Now, something that was very surprising to social demographers or students of population and labor force participation was that by 1990, this relationship had reversed itself. In other words, countries with higher rates of female labor force participation had higher rates of fertility. And if we look at the most recent data, we can see that this relationship has continued. Now, this graph is a little bit hard to read because countries have increasingly concentrated to the point where most countries have birth rates below 2 children on average per woman. So this positive relationship between female labor force participation and the total fertility rate has continued. Because what it signaled to demographers was that it is the countries that make it possible both for women to participate in paid work and to have children and raise a family that are the countries that are not suffering from low birth rates. So it is possible to say that indeed Prime Minister Abe's initiatives on increasing women's paid work were very well thought out and were very important and practical for Japan. However, why has the birth rate not increased in Japan? I argue in my book that the problem is that gender equality is the crucial link between these two goals of increasing female labor force participation and increasing a country's birth rate. So, in other words, the experience of other countries has demonstrated that it is important to increase gender equality in the workplace and in the household in order to maintain population replacement level birth rates. Of course, it is also important, as shown in the Japanese economy and a number of economies in Europe, to make sure that the younger generation has the economic means and support to form families that I think we will return to in the discussion. But focusing now on the issue of gender inequality, I'd like to show a next graph that indicates the difference in the the percentages of highly educated men and women who are in paid employment. This graph shows that in Japan, the labor force participation rate of highly educated men is about 20 percentage points higher than the rate for highly educated women. This is a much larger gap than in the United States or Sweden, or in fact, among all OECD countries. In fact, the only country that shows such a large gap between the labor force participation rates of highly educated men and women is Turkey. Of course, there are many other ways we can look at gender inequality in the Japanese labor force, and a very common way of measuring gender inequality is the difference between men's and women's average wages. In this graph, you can see that here again, Japanese gender inequality is quite large, along with gender inequality, as we know, in South Korea. So we can see indeed that gender inequality in Japan remains very high. Every year, the World Economic Forum issues a report called the Global Gender Gap. And this report shows the degree of gender inequality in 146 countries. Japan is the only post-industrial country that ranks higher than 100 in gender inequality. And in fact, the countries that are around the same ranking, low ranking in gender equality, are what we call developing countries. They are not post-industrial countries. The primary reasons for this low ranking in gender equality are that Japanese women indeed have a very unequal position in the Japanese labor market. So the Economic Opportunity and Participation Index that is used by the World Economic Forum actually shows that Japan ranks 121 among the 146 countries for which this has been measured. Index of political participation and authority, Japan ranks even lower, 139 out of 146 countries. Now, I would like to also point out that there are two other indexes that the World Economic Forum measures, and that is equality, gender equality in health, and gender equality in education. Indexes, Japan ranks quite high on gender equality. So it is really in the sphere of the economy and politics that gender inequality continues to exist at a high level in Japan. And as I have shown in previous slides, the birth rate remains low in Japan. What I argue in my book is that workplace conditions in Japan, hatarakikata, and social policies continue to be based on a male breadwinner, female carer model of the family. These conditions and social policies reproduce social norms about distinct gender roles for men and women. I argue that this has important negative consequences for a number of reasons. First of all, the pressure to be a strong breadwinner puts pressure on young single men to have good economic means before they marry. Given the expansion of non-regular hiseki work in Japan, and especially the participation of people in their 20s in non-regular work. This is detrimental. This economic requirement to marry is keeping many men from marrying early or not at all. And we can see this, for instance, in the lost generation from the 1990s, men who are now in the middle of their working lives and have not married. The proportion is very high among men who have been in hiseki for many years. My position is also that workplace conditions in Japan and social policies are reinforcing women's primary role in the family and men's primary role in paid work. We can come back to this point later on, but I feel that this creates a bad cycle, akujunkan, between rigid gender roles and difficult working conditions for men. In the next slide, I will show the relationship between the proportion of unpaid work, in other words, housework and childcare, that women do versus what men do, the relationship between that and the birth rate in a country. Clearly shows that in Japan and in South Korea, women do around 5 times as much unpaid work as their husbands. And this relationship continues even if wives are working full-time. Now, this is an average, and we can look at other figures in order to demonstrate that, as I said before, this holds for working wives as well as non-working wives. The graph shows that there is a negative relationship between the amount of housework and childcare that men do and the low amount of housework and childcare that men do and the birth rate. In other words, if we go up to the left-hand top corner of the graph, we see that in no country is it the case that men and women do the same amount of housework and childcare. But in the countries where men and women do close to the same amount, 1.8, or men do 1.8, or women do 1.8 or 2 times as much as men, in those countries, the birth rate is higher. A very central contributor to South Korean and Japanese men's low participation in housework and childcare is, of course, the long work hours that they experience in paid employment. So in my analyses, I looked at the relationship, statistical relationship between men's long paid work hours, their low contribution to unpaid household labor, and then the relationship to a country's low birth rate. And these statistical relationships are all what we can say statistically significant. Now, I do not mean to say that this explains low birth rates completely. It does not. However, these relationships are very important, especially when we look at the standard work hours in most European countries, which are universally lower than in Japan. In the many interviews my team conducted for my book, which compares Japan, Sweden, and the United States, this became extremely clear because the difference in work hours and the difference in men's time coming home in the evening is radically different between Sweden and Japan and the United States and Japan. How about a more cultural interpretation that involves the way that people think about men's and women's roles in society? Here as well, of course, we see differences between Japan and many other countries. This chart is a little bit more difficult to explain, but it is a chart that results from my research on kangae kata in different countries about gender roles. And what it shows is that the percentage of people believing in a dentoteki type of gender role arrangement, and also combined with the percentage of people who believe a way of thinking that says that women should do paid work, but their primary responsibility is in the home. Countries in which the proportion of the population believes in either this dentoteki kangae kata or what we call in my research pro-work conservative, the feeling that women should work for pay, but they should primarily take care of the home. If that combined percentage is high in a country, the country tends to have a low birth rate. The countries on the left-hand side where these gender role attitudes are strong, all of these countries have low birth rates. In contrast, countries at the other side of the graph, the right-hand side, where these ways of thinking about gender roles are much less common, these countries are higher birth rate countries. Now, when we look at the reforms and policies that the Japanese government has enacted in order to try to boost the birth rate, mainly these have been adjustments in the workplace for working mothers. These policies indeed have made it possible for many, many more women than in the past to have a child, take maternity and childcare leave, and return to the workplace. Japan has changed remarkably in the past 20 years in terms of the number of mothers who are working. However, I see a problem with these policies, and that is that they have been designed for working mothers. And meanwhile, the conditions of regular full-time employment for both men and women have not fundamentally changed, despite efforts at hataraki kata kaikaku. Another way of putting this is to say that adjustments have been made for Japanese working mothers, but there have not been modifications to work style that allow men to participate more in family life. I can give many examples of Japanese men whom we interviewed who said that they might consider taking childcare leave, but they feel it's impossible to do so given the conditions in their workplace. The contrast, again, with working mothers is very, very strong because about 80% of female employees who are entitled to take childcare leave do so, and this has become very widely accepted. I will conclude now by briefly mentioning 5 sets of policies that I outline in the final chapter of my book. And we can talk about these in more detail, perhaps, in the discussion. There has been much discussion and, in fact, much improvement in the number of childcare spaces that are available to young parents. However, there still remains in some areas of Japan a shortage of spaces for very young children. And another issue that I see is that the starting date every year for childcare is quite fixed. In other words, April 1st. Now, I am not a policy specialist, but we talked to many women who, for instance, gave birth to their child in February or March, and it was too early to put their baby in a child care facility in April. Often in these cases, women would have liked to return to work after 10 months or 1 year, but it was difficult for them to do so because of the timing of trying to get their child into a child care facility. So many women extended their child care leave to 16 months or 18 months or 2 years. This means that quite a number of women spend more time out of their workplace than they intended to. And this makes it more difficult in general for them to be integrated back into their workplace. And also, I would say that the mentality of many Japanese women has changed, and they wish to go back to work and balance child rearing and their jobs without a long delay. Now, I want to emphasize that throughout my book and in my policy recommendations, I am not trying to say what people should do. What I am trying to do is to say that people should have choices and be able to have those choices accommodated by contemporary social institutions. A second policy change that I recommend has been talked about for many years in Japan, and I realize that it's a complicated issue, but it involves the tax structure for husbands and wives in the labor market. Many women restrict their earnings and employment hours in order to meet the criteria of being able to have a tax advantage in their household through their husband's full-time work. And here I want to emphasize that I am not proposing that all Japanese wives work full-time, but among those women who would like to work full-time, if they are suppressing or limiting their number of work hours so that they can not exceed a yearly income of a certain level, then Japan is, and Japanese companies are losing valuable human capital. A third set of policy recommendations I have involves childcare leave. And I think I should be very quick here because we're reaching the time limit of my talk, and we will have time for discussion afterwards. But in these proposals, I particularly emphasize incentives for more Japanese fathers to take childcare leave. And again, I can give many examples from my research in Japan that indicates men's fearfulness of taking childcare leave. And their hesitation to take childcare leave is almost entirely based on their immediate work environment and pressure from their managers and their doryo, their peers, not to be absent from work. Again, we can go into this in more detail, perhaps in the discussion. But this is a very strong area in which I argue that social norms operate extremely strongly in Japan. And for that reason, the behavior of men is really quite understandable. I will go through the fourth and fifth policy recommendations very quickly. Number 4 is a very general recommendation, and it is not easy to achieve. Here, my proposal is to make adjustments and policies in Japanese workplaces that accommodate parents more gender neutral. The adjustments that have been made for working mothers, I would like to see more of those adjustments extended to fathers as well. What will this do? This will normalize the possibility of being a parent and a good employee. Finally, there is the issue of, that I mentioned earlier, of the economic situation of the younger generation, people in their 20s in particular, 20s and early 30s, is a very complicated issue and involves wage rates and the division between seiki and hiseiki koyosha. But it is an issue that it is imperative for the government to try to tackle. Finally, I would like to say a word about kodomo teate. So experiences from various countries in Europe and research that has looked at various policies have demonstrated that kodomo teate, cash payments to parents, are not very effective in changing the birth rate. Some of the policies and the policy areas I've emphasized, such as parental leave for fathers, shorter, more flexible working hours for everyone, are strongly correlated with higher birth rates. So in conclusion, my personal feeling is that the purpose of policy proposals should be to modify individuals' behavior by increasing the incentives for the behaviors that are seen as valuable for society, for the individuals. I believe that this can lead to changes in social norms that are positive for both men and women, for families, and ultimately for Japanese society as a whole.
ブリントン先生、ありがとうございました。それでは討議に移ります。 本日は内閣官房参与で、全世代型社会保障構築本部事務局、総括事務局長の山崎史郎事務局長に、ご参加をいただいております。まずはじめに、山崎参与に、コメントをお伺いしたいと思いますが、時間の許す限り、視聴者の皆様方からのご質問も取り上げてまいりたいと思いますので、ご質問のある方は、Q&A 機能を使ってお寄せいただければと思います。それでは、山崎参与、お願いいたします。
はい。聞こえますでしょうか？大丈夫です。私からはですね、コメントと、あと質問ということで、お話ししたいと思います。まず第一にですね、私は実は、ブリントン博士のさんの本を読みましてですね、大変感銘を受けまして、この本を最近はオフィスで読んでない人間とはディスカッションしないと言ってほしいですね。それはもう時間の無駄だということを言っているぐらいですね、大変素晴らしい本です。ぜひ読んでいただきたいと思います。で、今日の講演とこの本の内容で、やっぱり、ちゃんとみんなで共通認識を持つべきだと思うことがございますので、少しコメントしたいと思います。まず一つは、今日本が置かれているのは、2つの目標を同時に達成しなきゃならないという、このことです。経済的には労働参加を進めること。そしてもう一つは出生率を上げること。これを同時に達成しなきゃならない。しかも残された時間は非常に短い。早くしていかなきゃならない。このことをですね、まずみんなでやっぱり当然認識しなきゃならないと思います。このことがないとですね、議論が毎日は進まないということです。つまり、経済政策、労働政策と家族政策は今一緒になってですね、展開しなきゃならない。一方だけやってもダメなんだよということだと思います。これは第一点です。第二点目のですね、やっぱり確認すべきことは、実はその言葉はですね、この本に一番明確に出てるんですが、共働き、共育てモデルを作るということです。共働きというのは、今言った労働面、共育てというのは家族政策。このモデルができるかどうかがですね、すべての鍵で、しかも、それは実は日本はですね、できてなくて、しかもその達成するためにはですね、やっぱり他の国との違いもやっぱりよく勉強する必要があると。じゃあ一体何が足りないかということをやっぱり勉強する中でですね、この中で一番提起されたのは、私大変感銘を受けたのは、まあもちろん制度の問題はありますが、社会規範という問題が非常に大きくなっている。つまり簡単に言いますと、私を含めですけど、男性と企業の意識の問題だよということです。そこが変わらない限り、この問題は解決しないんだと。実はこれが私本当に鍵だと思います。これまで我々はできなかった。一番の障害は、残念ながら男性企業、すいません、企業も入れますが、この子育ての問題を自分の問題と思ってこなかったということに全て私は原因があると思います。さて、これをどう変えるかということがない限りはですね、いろんなことをやっても結局はですね、変わらないだろうというのを私は非常に意識してますし、今日のお話を聞いてますますですね、確信を感じました。そして、その変わり方ですが、ジェンダー平等にはこの本に2つあって、男性的なジェンダー平等と女性的なジェンダー平等です。その中で、本当の正解というのは、女性も変わるけれど、男性も変わる。両方変わるというですね、ジェンダーニュートラルというのは本当なんだ。そうだと思います。日本の女性は本当にいろんな面で変わって、一生懸命努力していたんですが、結局男性が変わってないと。残念ながら本当に恥ずかしいんですけれど、これをですね、もうしない限り、この2つの目標は達成できないということを早く我々やっぱり気づいてですね、早く行動に起こさなきゃならない。これが結局のところ私の今の確信を持っているんです。そこで、質問はですね、先生に聞きたいのは、日本の企業と男性は変わるかどうか。本当に変わるだろうか。そして変わるとするならば、どれぐらいの時間がかかるかと。私は私の答えを持ってますけど、まず、先生の答えをですね、これは予測でもいいですし、願望でもいいです。どちらでも構いません。
Thank you very much. Of course, this is a very difficult question. So the Japanese so-called employment system, even though it has changed to some degree, it remains very, very strong. And I know that many people in Japan, labor economists and people in the government, are talking about hatarakikata kaikaku and also the employment system in general. And I have many things to say, but I think that the younger generation of men in their 20s, men in their 30s, I think there is quite a large number of them who would like to live a different kind of lifestyle than their fathers lived. But I think many companies make it very difficult for them to fulfill that idea. And one example of this, which I discuss in the book quite extensively, is that we went back and re-interviewed a large number of the people, men and women, that we had interviewed in 2012. We went back and re-interviewed them in 2019-20.
ポイントだけ申し上げますと、非常に難しい質問ということで、私自身はですね、雇用システムは変わってはいるんですけど、まだかなりそのまんま変わっていないところがたくさんありましてですね、これは経済学者も政府の人もいろいろ言ってるんですね。ライフスタイルとワークスタイルも変えなくてはいけないとか、制度も変えなきゃいけないという議論がたくさんあるんですけれども、それで一方でですね、男女20代、30代の方、若い男の方、20代、30代の方にインタビューを行ってきたんですが、そういった人たちが言っているのはですね、自分たちの父親とは違った別のそのワークスタイルを取りたいと思っている人もたくさんいるんですね。しかしながら現代の企業の中ではそれが制度的にもできないということ。そして、多く私の本でも書いているんですが、インタビューかなり多くの人にしました男女2012年、19年、20年にインタビューしてきたんですけれども。
So in the follow-up interview, the second set of interviews that we did, I purposely included quite a provocative question.
引っ掛けるというんではないですけれども、相手を刺激するような質問を2番目のインタビューでは入れてみました。
This question was, do you think it's a good idea for the Japanese government to make it mandatory or required for new fathers to take some child care leave?
で、その質問の一つがですね、新たに父親になった男性はですね、その育児休暇を取るべきだ。要するに必須と考えるべきかと、必須にすべきかと、日本政府ですね、という質問をしてみました。
And I asked this question realizing that it may not be possible, that it may not be likely that the Japanese government would request this of men. But I wanted to hear what men and women thought about this proposal.
もともとこれは政府がそういうことをですね、制度的に強制するとは思ってはいなかったんですけれども、とにかく聞いてみたかったので、この質問をしてみました。
What I found in the interviews was that more than 80% of the interviewees said, yes, this should be done.
で、分かったことはですね、80% 以上の人が、はい、それは育児休暇を、制度的に、すべきだということだったんですね。
And one of the things that we did in our interviews throughout this research was to ask people's opinion and then ask them to explain why they thought the way they do.
インタビューで全部やってきたのは、まず質問をして、それに対してなぜそう思うのかという質問もしました。
Also, I was very careful to put this type of question at the end of the interview after people have become comfortable speaking with the interviewer. I used only Japanese interviewers for Japan and only Swedish interviewers for Sweden, and so forth. But I asked this type of question at the end of the interview so that people would feel more free to speak what they really think than they might at the beginning of an interview.
特に注意を払ったのはですね、これはインタビュー始まってからいろいろ話に慣れてきて、インタビューする人にも慣れてきた頃に最後にこの革新的な質問をすると、話しやすい環境を作って質問しました。
So what was particularly fascinating to me as a social scientist and as a sociologist was the reasons that men and women gave for saying, yes, men should be required to take child care leave. And I will tell you the main reasons.
社会学者としてですね、非常に私が興味があったのは、なぜそれを取るべきだと男性が思ったのかという理由なんですね。それについて今からお話しします。
The reasons had to do with strong social norms and social pressures. So many interviewees said, because otherwise, if this is not done, Japan will change too slowly.
で、要は社会的圧力というのも厳然として残っているので、そういう状況が作られないと非常に変革はスローになるだろうという答えでした。
Some people said, unless this comes from the top, unless this directive or this requirement comes from above, change will be much, much slower.
もう一つあったのが、その上からですね、要は指令として、命令として降りてこない限りは、この変化はほとんどとして進まないだろう。
And this was very consistent with what men had told us 8 years before about the reasons that they felt they couldn't take child care leave, even though they recognized that legally they could.
これは8年前のですね、インタビューともほとんど同じなんですけれども、やはり、法的に取りたくても法的に取れないということがあったわけです。
At that time, many men said, because I can't take it because no one around me, none of the men around me in the workplace take it. And in particular, no one who's above me in status takes child care leave. No men above me in status.
この答えはですね、私のそのインタビューを受けた人の周りの男性、特に上司は決してその育児休暇を取らないということだったわけです。
One of my main messages in this book is that it is unrealistic to expect individuals, kojin de, to be pioneers, to start a new behavior that they feel is not very socially accepted.
で、私はこの本の中で主なメッセージとして書いているんですけれども、その個人にですね、その変革のパイオニアになってくれというのは非常に非現実的だと思うんですね。
I think it is a great deal to expect of people to change individually and try to become, in a sense, a role model for other people. It's not impossible, but it takes a very strong person to do that. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that of very many people.
やはりそういうロールモデルや鏡になるような人というのはですね、そういう人は非常に強い人でないとできないわけですね。ですからそういった意味ではそうなることが非現実的であると言わざるを得ません。
And when I say this irrespective of gender. I say it for human beings, and especially in a society such as Japan, where social pressures are very strong. In the book, I use as a positive example of social norms in Japan, the behaviors towards mask wearing during the pandemic.
で、これはですね、日本のような非常に社会のプレッシャーが強い、ところではですね、やっぱり男性、女性に関わらず、これが起こるということで、本の中で良い例として挙げているのがマスクですね。
So social norms can sometimes be very good and have very good effects on society. If you compare the Japanese attitude towards mask wearing with the attitude in the United States, it is extremely shocking.
日本人のそのマスクをつけるかつけないかについての態度を日本人とアメリカ人を比べるとですね、これ非常にショッキングな違いがあります。
And what I mean is that when Japanese people were asked in a social experiment early in the pandemic why they wear masks, the most common reason given was because mawari no hito wear masks. This is not a reason that most Americans would mention or even think of.
かというと、日本人は周りの人がつけてるから、もう早い段階でつけなきゃいけないというふうに思ったわけですけども、アメリカ人はですね、そんなことを思いもしないし、絶対言わないわけです。
As you know, in the United States, many people said, I will not wear a mask because it's my right not to wear a mask. So the idea of 自分の権利 is very strong.
アメリカ人がつけない理由としては、自分はマスクをつけない権利があるという権利の主張から来ているわけです。
In contrast, the discussion of 自分の権利 in the Japanese interviews almost never came up.
いう話はほとんどもう全く出てこなかったですね。
And when I mention this, it's in relation again to men's child care leave. Even if men realize that they do have the legal right to take child care leave, they pretty much told us that that doesn't matter. What matters is whether their behavior will be acceptable.
まあ男子のですね、育児休暇に関しても法的な権利があってもそれは関係ないと。むしろそれにその行動が受け入れられるかどうかということがポイントです。
I'm afraid this has become a very long answer, and I'm not sure it's an answer at all. But I think that in the Japanese case, the effects from mawari no hito are very strong, and the effects from one's mewe no hito are very strong. And in this kind of set of social conditions, I think making some desired behaviors mandatory is a very good possible solution.
ですからこういった上の人からの命令は必須とか、周りの人の目が圧倒的だというような社会ではですね、やっぱりこういうことを必須事項、要求事項として掲げることがむしろ必要かもしれません。
じゃあ、一言。ありがとうございます。もう指摘した通りだと思いますね。さっき、日本の答えが義務付け賛成が多かったという話は、決して私は主体性がないっていうんじゃなくて、今言われたように、同調性ですね。同調。周りのことをすごく気にするという部分で、これはいい、まあちょっとまずい時もありますけど、いいこともたくさんできるわけですから、私本当変わると思ってまして、私の願望はですね、3年でまず少なくともですね、男性の育児参加って大きく変わる。もしダメだったら、今度夕食をその時には本当思っています。いや、これは、いや、必須じゃなくて。それでもですね、きっとこの問題がこういうことだということが分かった時からですね、今日まさにみんなが日本では変わる、私は非常にそういう力を持ってますから、それが奇跡と言われるぐらいのですね、ことをしないともう間に合わないのが本当ですから、私は3年で変わると思うし、みんなで変えなきゃいかんと。
嬉しい、それがと嬉しいです。
今日聞いてる方は必ず皆さん3年で頑張るように、ぜひよろしくお願いします。
Actually, after I published my book, quite a few managers in large Japanese companies wrote to me in email. They found my email address and wrote to me and said, our company is changing. And having observed and studied Japan for many decades, I do very much feel that there is a attitude in Japan that certain types of change are necessary and we're going to do it. And I think I feel quite positively.
やっぱりある種の変化はやっぱ必要だというふうに考えればですね、良い方向に行くんじゃないかというのは私はポジティブに今見ています。大企業の人が私の会社は変わっているっていうふうに E メールでも言ってきてくれるので、
ありがとうございます。予定の時間を過ぎておりますが、せっかくの機会ですので、皆様からご質問もいただいておりますので、それにお答えをいただこうと思います。まず、相模女子大学大学院教授の白川東子先生からご質問をいただいております。白川東子先生は、女性と経済に関する勉強会のメンバーでもいらっしゃいます。読み上げます。労働時間を抑えても子供のそばにいたいという人に働くことを強制できません。ゆるく背中押しをするには何が政策として有効でしょうか。北欧では働かないと年金額が低くなることが背中を押しているようです。ということです。いかがでしょうか。
If I understand your question, I think this is probably a policy matter. In other words, women, especially women with young children, should not be forced to work or compelled to work. There are ways of designing pension policy and tax policy that, again, gives people choices. And that's what I want to emphasize. I certainly do not want to argue that anyone should be forced to live a lifestyle that they're not desiring to live. But there are ways of designing policies that can accommodate these different lifestyles.
いろんなライフスタイルを受け入れるような政策ですとか、税制を、オプションとして、チョイスとして与えるのが望ましいと思います。
では次のご質問に移りたいと思います。母親の給与所得と保育料の支払いがほぼ同じ額で、何のために働いているのかわからなくなることがあるという話をよく聞きます。子ども手当にかかる予算を保育料の補助に充てることはできないのか、充当できないのか、と個人的に思うところもあるところ、アメリカやスウェーデンなどの保育料についてお伺いしたいです。アメリカやスウェーデンの保育料は母親の負担になっていますか、それとも政府から補助がありますか、などです。
This is a very important question. So in Sweden, none of our interviewees, none of them mentioned the cost of child care centers. Now, in Sweden, taxes are very high. And Swedish people pay for government-provided benefits through their taxes. And this is the reason why the cost of childcare was not mentioned by our interviewees. Now, in a moment, I'll say what the US situation is like.
そう、スウェーデンでは、誰もセンターのですね、チャイルドケアセンターのコストの話はしないわけですね。で、つまり、スウェーデンはタックスが高い代わりに、その税金を使って、そういった費用をですね、払っているので、そういったことはですね、議論の対象にならないわけですね。で、一方でアメリカはどうかと言いますと、
So here there's a very large contrast with the United States. In other words, Sweden versus the United States, and also Japan versus the United States. In the United States, we do not have publicly subsidized, government subsidized childcare.
アメリカの場合はですね、公的なそういった育児上の支援手当金というのは出ていません。
For this reason, raising children in the United States is very, very expensive.
アメリカでは子育ては非常にお金がかかります。
So, on many occasions, I have had Japanese friends visit the United States and eventually say to me, "Why do Americans have children? How can they have children?"
日本の友達がアメリカに来た時によく言うのは、なぜアメリカ人は子供を持つんだ、どうやって育ててるんだ、育てられるんだと聞かれます。
And in fact, I think that eventually this will become a problem in the United States. The United States birth rate is beginning to decline a little bit. And I think part of it is the very high cost of childcare. So as childcare options in the United States, we may employ a full-time babysitter, or we may send our child to a private daycare center. We may rely on our parents if they live close by, but the options are not very good. And the Japanese situation is actually much, much better. There are definitely cases in the United States where a mother's wages are about equivalent to the cost of having her child in daycare or childcare. And in such cases, women often quit working, indeed. もったいない。
アメリカはフルタイムでベビーシッターに子供を預けるか、あるいはデイケアに子供を預けるか、あるいは両親が行ったら、近くにいたら面倒を見てもらうという状況なんですけれども、やはり非常に日本と比べると状況は良くないということで、ほとんど母親の稼いだ金額がですね、そういうケアセンターの料金とほとんど同じぐらいになってしまう。
So, cost of childcare in Japan is much lower than in large American cities. And this is a great advantage that Japan has, the childcare system. I realize that there is a shortage of childcare workers in Japan, and also the pay, the kyuryo for childcare workers is not very high. These are problems. But I think, again, Japan has a great advantage compared to the United States in terms of high quality childcare centers that the public trusts. Japan is way ahead of the United States.
比べると、特にアメリカの大都市なんかと比べると、そういう子育てのコストは非常に日本はまだ恵まれている。で、アメリカの場合も、問題はですね、日本の場合は、そういう育児上の労働力も足らないし、給料も安い。これは問題ですよね。でも、非常に品質は高いし、そういったセンター、ケアセンターのですね、信頼、一般の人からの信頼も日本の場合は厚いので、アメリカと比べるとはるかにそういった点では良いと思います。
ブリントン先生、ありがとうございます。まだ質問があるので、もうちょっとよろしいでしょうか。せっかくの機会ですので。はい。ブリントン先生、ご講演どうもありがとうございましたというご質問の方がいらっしゃいまして、これまで日本では結婚することや出産することは個人的な選択であり、政府の介入はしないという考え方でした。最近変化しているようにも感じました。で、出生率を上げるような家族政策は個人の選択への介入であるという批判はアメリカやスウェーデンなどではあるのでしょうか。 もし批判があるとしたら、どのようなロジックで他の国の政府は家族政策を進めているのでしょうかというご質問です。
This is a very interesting question. So, if I can speak briefly about Swedish social policy, in order to write my book, I studied social policies in the Northern European countries quite a lot. And what I discovered was that, especially in the case of Sweden, which is seen as a kind of pioneer in social policies, the original motivation for constructing so-called family-friendly social policies was not to increase the birth rate. The original motivation of the government was the following: to make it possible for men and women to have the number of children they wanted to have and to work in paid employment. In other words, the government was seeing, this was in the 1970s, the government was seeing more and more women participate in the labor force. And the government realized that in order for the birth rate not to go down, family-friendly policies were necessary, but the policies were originally not designed to raise the birth rate.
だからもともとですね、スウェーデンなんかでは、出生率を上げるためのような、その家族に優しいポリシーというものではなくてですね、もしその個人がその子供をできるだけ欲しいというのであれば、そうすればよろしいんじゃないでしょうか。産んでくださいよ。しかし、同時にその仕事もしてくださいよというような、政府の態度といいますか、アプローチだったわけですね。で、1970年代に女性はどんどん職場に出ていったんですけれども、やはり政府がそこで気がついたことはですね、家庭に優しいポリシーというのは、結局のところ、So this is a Sweden case, right?
Yes.
Sweden in the 1970s, people go over to the workplace more and more. When government noted that the family-friendly policy itself is beneficial, right? で、家族に優しい、家庭に優しい政策というものは結局社会にとって利益をもたらすということをですね、政府は知ったわけです。
Now, Sweden and the Northern European countries have some great advantages over Japan, over the United States, and over a number of other countries. They're small countries. Their populations are small. And their governments have been designed to provide social assistance to their citizens. And even in the 1970s in Sweden, the ideology or the thinking of the Swedish state was men and women both have the right as citizens to work in paid employment if they want to. They also have the right to be parents if they want to, and to have enough time to raise their children. So again, going back to my discussion of rights, these were framed by the government as rights that citizens have, men and women. And so from the very beginning, these Northern European social policies were based on that logic, and also were based on the ideal of gender equality.
ここスウェーデンとはですね、ジェンダーイコーリティ、ジェンダーの平等の理想的な形を言っていたということが言えると思うんですね。つまり1970年代からもうスウェーデンでは 考え方としては、男女、いずれのどちらの権利としても、市民として、もし働きたければ働けばいいし、もし両親ともその子供をケアしたいと思うのであれば、そうしてもいいという考え方を基本的に持っていたわけですね。これは本当に理想的な、なんていうんでしょうか、社会システムの考え方だと思います。
So, as ordinary people and as social scientists, we need to recognize that there is a kind of combination of ways of thinking and ways of constructing social policies and institutions. This is a combination of things. And when I look at the example of Sweden, I think, they were lucky. They were lucky. And because they were designing policies that they thought would give opportunities to everyone to lead the kind of life they wanted. And as a result of the thinking behind those social policies, work hours are much shorter. They're regulated. Working hours are shorter. Parents have considerable flexibility in their work hours. So you can think of it as a system that is designed to support people who want to engage in productive paid work and want to spend time with their children. So this is very lisoteki, also from an American point of view.
スウェーデンの例っていうのは、本当に私から社会学者としてもですね、非常にラッキーだというふうに考えるわけですね。そのポリシーっていうのは機会を与える、つまり、市民がしたいと思う方法に、行けるような機会を与える。特にスウェーデンの場合は背景としては、ワーク時間はですね、もともとなんていうんでしょうか、制限があったわけですね。時間は比較的少なかったし。で、その働き方も柔軟性が設けられていたので、非常に背景としても良かった。生産的で働けたし、子供のケアもできたということで、スウェーデンは非常にラッキーだと思います。
In the United States, also, we have no intervention or policy by the government to encourage people to have children. But we also have almost no support from the government for people who have children. So believe it or not, the United States is the only country among all post-industrial countries that does not even have paid maternity leave. The only support we have from the national government is a guarantee that new mothers can have 12 weeks of unpaid leave from their workplace. This means that low-income women need to go back to work right away, which is very bad for their own, can be very damaging to their own health and to the health of their baby.
アメリカの場合はですね、介入はないんですね。政府がこうしろと。子供が、
給料がある。paid.
I understand. アメリカの場合はですね、要するに子供がいても、サポートないわけです。だから、政府の支援がない、介入がないっていうのは支援がないというのと同じなんですね。つまり、アメリカは唯一の先進国の中で唯一の有給休暇、ごめんなさい、育児休暇、有給育児休暇がない国なんです。つまり、だけど、唯一あるとすれば、あるのは、新たに母親になった女性は12週間無給で働く、休むことはできると。だから、無給なので、もう産んでから即もう職場に戻らなきゃいけない。でもそれは母親の体にも子供にも良くないという状況なんですね。それがアメリカの状況です。
So if I can just summarize, I think we can think of the three countries, Sweden, the US, and Japan, in the following way. Sweden has a combination of family-friendly kangaekata on the part of men and women, and supporting social policies from the government, policies that support families.
スウェーデンの場合は、 非常に家族に、ファミリーに優しいという考え方、ソーシャルポリシーとしてファミリーを支えるというポリシーがあります。これはスウェーデンですね。
In America's case, our thinking has changed a great deal. And many people in the United States, not everyone, but many people feel that gender equality is quite important. However, we don't have social policies to support the idea of husbands and wives both working and having some support from the government for taking care of their children. So we have strong, positive, family-friendly, gender equality-friendly social norms, but we don't have the policies that Sweden has.
これはまあいろいろ変わってきたんですけれども、多くの人が思っていることだと思うんですけれども、そのソーシャルポリシーが要するにないんです。ソーシャルノームとして、規範として、そういったものをやってもいいという雰囲気といいますか、環境はあるんだけれども、実際のソーシャルポリシーがないので、両親が共働きしつつ、さらに子供に対して政府が何か支援をしてくれるとかいうですね、ソーシャルポリシーの部分がないから、非常に、苦しいんですね。困るんですね。
困りますね。
そういうのがアメリカですね。
And in Japan's case, as we talked about earlier, many of the policies that have been passed are very good policies. And I think Japan can continue to create good policies. And in Japan's case, I think the challenge is having a combination of social supportive norms for family and for men and women working outside the home and in the family, and boosting those norms so that Japan becomes a more family-friendly society. But the policies in Japan so far, even though they haven't boosted the birth rate, the policies and the future policies that can be created are very promising.
日本の場合はですね、非常にたくさんの良いポリシー、政策がですね、打ち出されてきて、それは非常に良いものだった。そして今後もそれは続くと思うんですね。良いポリシーが作られ続けると思うんです。ただ問題は、ソーシャルサポート、社会としての批判がないと。社会のノームが批判がない。つまり、家族にとっても優しいとか、両親が外で働ける、共働きできるとか、家に行ってその子供の世話を見るとかですね、そういったことに対する社会的な批判が、存在しない。ですから、ポリシー自体は非常に良いものになった。これからも良いものが来るとは思うんですけれども、やはりソーシャルノーム、批判が家族に、優しいものにならなくてはいけないと思います。
ありがとうございます。まだ質問たくさんいただいてるんですが、あと2問、先生、あと2問いいですか？はい。はい、大丈夫ですか？じゃあ行きます。出生率に関しては宗教的な考え方が影響していることはありませんか？例えば、キリスト教では、現在アメリカで問題になっている中絶やバースコントロールについて保守的な人たちもいます。こうした、キリスト教の考え方などが、出生率に影響している、という研究はありますでしょうか？お考えをお聞かせください。
Actually, the research on the birth rate in the United States has shown that there's not very much difference by religion anymore. It used to be the case that there was a difference. Of course, Catholics had more children in the past, but there's not very much difference by religion anymore. Instead, what is happening in the United States and it's also beginning to show up in Japan is that people in the middle and upper middle class have the economic means, are more likely to have the economic means to have 2 children or even 3 children. Whereas people in the working class and below have lower rates of getting married and therefore lower rates of having children. So this pattern was a pattern that Hayashi-san and I talked about actually earlier today. This is a pattern that's showing up throughout the post-industrial world. Having children and raising them takes time and money. And especially with the level of economic inequality that we see in post-industrial societies, certainly in the United States, but also in Japan, it's becoming more and more the case that people at the bottom of the economic or income structure are less likely to marry and less likely to have children. And this is a 21st century issue.
場合はですね、宗教、過去においてはですね、特にカトリックの、地域ですとかですと、確かに子供はどんどん増えたりとかですね、宗教の影響がありましたけれども、今はアメリカでは、リサーチの結果でも影響はほとんどないです。で、それで、これは日本でも、今度は経済の話になりますけれども、アッパーミドルクラス、要するに日本中流よりも上の人はですね、経済的に余裕があって、2人、3人とか子供を持てるんですが、それ以下の人ですね、もうワーキングクラスの人で、非常に給料が少ない人は結婚もなかなかできないし、子供を持てないということがあります。で、林さんもおっしゃってたと思うんですけれども、子育てにはですね、時間とお金がかかる。ということで、経済的な不平等な社会があるポストインダストリアルソサイティでは、アメリカも日本もですね、21世紀において同じような問題を抱えているということが言えると思います。
ありがとうございます。今のお答えにも関連するご質問をいただいております。まず日本の男性の意識は変わりつつあると思います。育児休業を取得している人も増えていますし、実際に、私もこの質問されている方ですね、もう保育園の送り迎えに行くと半分は、パパです。一方で、経済的に考えると、特に東京都内では、さらにもう一人子供とは考えられません。で、子供の将来を考えると、経済的に余裕がないと子供をもう一人という考えになりません。先ほどの話とも関連しますが、ぜひご意見をいただければということです。
Certainly, thank you for the comment. Certainly, Tokyo is a very difficult environment in which to raise children. It's expensive. Remote work, possibility of remote work has increased, but nevertheless, for many people commuting to the office, even 3 days a week or 4 days a week is difficult and time consuming. So I very much agree that from an economic point of view, a financial point of view, it's hard to have more than one child in Tokyo. It's hard also in New York City and in large American cities where cost of living is very high. So there's no easy solution to this, but one of the things I recommend, especially in relation to men's child care leave, is that when men take child care leave, they should get 100% of their salary, not 60% or 70%. And also in my proposals, I say that mothers should get 100% of their salaries during maternity leave. Now, this is expensive, but I think that at least allowing parents to have some time away from work that's fully paid would be extremely helpful. And in many countries, it's been shown that if childcare leave for men and for women is reimbursed, if the the salary is paid, it's much easier for people to take it, and they don't have to worry about, at least for that period of time, their household income declining. But I agree with you that large cities, it's difficult in large cities to raise children. And it's also difficult, of course, because many people, particularly in large cities, live far away from their parents. And it's difficult to have any help from relatives. I do think, because Japan is such a rapidly aging society, I think there are wonderful possibilities for older people who have finished their working lives to help young families with childcare. Now, that's not easy because it involves establishing trust, but Japan has a wonderful population of older adults, many of whom are not working for pay any longer, but would enjoy working with children. And I think that's a matter for local governments. And I know some local governments in Japan have been very active in promoting this kind of program, because as we always say, it takes a village to raise a child. It's hard to raise a child by yourself or two people, especially if they're working. But more community support and pleasure, and having children around and taking care of children, that's the kind of environment that we would want to strive for.
経済、これからまだリモートワークなんかも残るでしょうし、増える可能性もありますので、東京なんかではもう一人子供を持つというのはやはり欲しいですよね。で、たとえそのオフィスに3日間、1週間のうち3日間行くという状況であっても、やはりまだそれでも子育ては難しいと思いますね。で、東京でもう一人というのは難しいと。それで、さらに、社会的には、私のレコメンデーションですけれども、男性の育休ですね。それに、これを60% とか 70% じゃなくて、100% を支払ってもらうようなシステムになれば、かなりいい状況になるんじゃないか。これは同じように母親の場合は産休でも 100% 払ってもらえるということになれば、非常にいいサポートになると思います。これはコスト的にはお金がかかることなんですけども、それがいいと思います。で、両親ともですね、仕事場から離れて時間を設けて、例えば子育てする場合も、その分のお金が出ればですね、素晴らしいサポートになると思います。で、あと、例えば大都市ですね、ニューヨークの大都市なんかですと、その親戚とか両親とかがですね、遠くに住んでて、ヘルプしてもらえないので、非常に大変ですね。で、日本はその点、近くに住んでたりとかですね、ご両親じゃないや、おじいちゃん、おばあちゃんがですね、助けてくれる。それで喜んで、支払えないのに、助けてくれるという、非常に、素晴らしい状況が発生していると思いますね。ですから、特にやはり、お金が政府から、子育てしているときに、あるいは産休のときに、100% 払ってもらえれば非常にいいのではないかというふうに思います。
ありがとうございます。もう大幅に予定された時刻も過ぎております。ブリントン先生、山崎参与、そして視聴者の皆様、 活発なご議論いただきまして、本当にありがとうございました。途中音声の不具合がございまして、大変申し訳ございませんでした。山崎さんから、日本の男性の意識、そして男性の育休、3年で変わるという話がございました。ぜひ、3年後にですね、ブリントン先生によく見ていただいて、またこうしたディスカッションの機会を持てればと思います。それでは、本日の Esri 政策フォーラムを終了いたします。ご視聴いただきまして、本当にありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。